Hey, welcome back. We're now ready to start creating some blueprints based on our base pawn class. So this is going to be a relatively easy lecture, especially if you have any experience working in blueprints. Now, in order to keep our file structure orderly, we're going to click on the content folder, and here in the content folder, we're going to create a new folder. So let's go ahead and right-click and select New Folder. And since this folder will hold all of the blueprints we create for this game project, we're simply going to call this folder Blueprints. Now, double-click on Blueprints to open that up, and we're going to create a new folder here. So right-click, New Folder, and let's call this one Pawns. So we're going to put all of the pawn blueprints that we create right here in the Pawns folder. So let's go ahead and create those. I'm going to head back over to Toon Tanks under C++ classes, where we have our base pawn C++ class. And we can create a blueprint based on this C++ class by right-clicking and selecting Create Blueprint Class based on base pawn. Now, we're given the option to select where we should put this new blueprint. I'm going to click the drop-down next to Blueprints so I can see the Pawns folder. I'm going to select that, and this is where I'd like to stick the new blueprint. Now, let's go ahead and give this blueprint a meaningful name. Now, a good convention is to prefix the name with BP so we know that this is a blueprint. So I'm going to say blueprint, and let's call this BP Pawn Tank. This is going to be the tank that we're going to control as we're rolling around and bombing stuff in this game. So BP Pawn Tank, let's click Create Blueprint Class, and here is our blueprint for the pawn tank, and up here at the top right, we can see Parent Class Base Pawn, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, over to the top left, we have the Components panel, and we see at the very top, it says BP Pawn Tank in parentheses self. This is the overall blueprint itself, and in the Details panel, we have all sorts of properties that we can see that are exposed by default. Now, back over to the Components panel, just under BP Pawn Tank, we see all of the components that we created in C++. We have the capsule, which is designated as the root. That's why it's at the very top. And attached to that, we have the base mesh, then the turret mesh, then the projectile spawn point. And notice that these are indented, indicating that they are attached to the component above them. And they have these useful little drop-downs that allow us to collapse things that are attached to any given component if we want to do that. Now, if you've worked in blueprints before, you'll notice that something is missing. If you select any one of these components, over here in the Details panel, it's suddenly very empty. And that's because there is nothing exposed to blueprints from the C++ side. This is something that we have control over as C++ developers in Unreal Engine. You can expose components to blueprints. That's why we can see them here in the Components panel, but we have not exposed any of the properties that belong to these components because that is something we actively have to specify from the C++ side. And we're going to learn how to do that in the videos to come. So when it comes time to take the capsule component and adjust its size, or take the base mesh and actually assign a mesh to it, we'll be able to start doing those things once we've exposed those properties, and then we can see them here in the Details panel and give those properties valid values. So now we have a BP Pawn Tank. As I mentioned, this is going to be the tank that we roll around and wreak havoc on the world. So that's great. Let's go ahead and close out of BP Pawn Tank. And next, we'd like to create another blueprint class based on base pawn. And this can be for the tower. That's the enemy that we will have posted up at this central point here in the level that we will do battle with. So this will be a challenge for you. You're going to create a new blueprint class based on base pawn. Go ahead and call this BP_pawn turret. So pause the video and create this blueprint now. Okay, let's go ahead and make our second blueprint based on base pawn. So here's our base pawn. Let's right-click, Create Blueprint Class based on base pawn. And let's select the Pawns folder, and we can call this BP Pawn Turret. And click Create Blueprint Class, and here is our Pawn Turret blueprint. Now, it looks exactly the same as the base pawn, and we're going to change that in the next lecture when we start exposing these components to blueprints so that we can set some properties here to make this blueprint look different than the pawn tank. So in this lecture, we derived a BP pawn tank blueprint from the base pawn class, as well as a BP pawn turret. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about how we can make these look different from each other by exposing their components to Blueprint so we can edit some properties. I'll see you soon.